My name is Mike Tresca. I am the host today, committee chair of the CAR-PGA. Welcome to our latest virtual panel. This is the October edition, and I wanted to get through a couple of things because we've had a lot of exciting news going on. One of the first is that I wanted to welcome 3 new members. We got Kirsten Hamilton, who is an RPG educator and store owner, so welcome, Kirsten. Aaron Armstrong, who is an RPG educator, and John Peterson, who is an RPG scholar. So that's a big deal. If you know John, you know why I'm holding this book up, which is The Game Wizards. So John has a book out. John also is the author of Playing at the World. I know John, we've met before at Gen Con, and he is just an amazing and very prolific scholar who's done massive amounts of work from primary sources. When I tend to write, a lot of what I write tends to be. Oh, I'm getting the echo. Can you hear that echo?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna mute folks in between, and then I can unmute you, or you can mute yourself as we go here. Sorry. So yeah, that was why it was happening. This book, Game Wizards, is about the story of Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. It's a really interesting dialogue about both TSR and the rise of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's really about 2 people. It's about Dave and it's about Gary. So everything you think you know, you don't know until you've read this book. And I'm not done. You can see I'm mostly there. There's notes in the back, which I will go through as well. And it is the best compliment I can give it is if you ever read Devil in the White City. Devil in the White City is a story about the Chicago World's Fair and one of the first serial killers at the time. It is all primary sources. It's tremendously researched, and there's not a lot of interpretation here. This is, every resource, which means, of course, John has a massive amount of access and material. So to that end, that's a little homework too. I encourage you all to buy it. I'll put it in our newsletter as well, if the lighting is better. But also we are going to have John as a guest speaker. So he will be on the next virtual panel, November 4th. And we'll be talking to him to really get into both Game Wizards and sort of a bunch of other stuff. But I wanted to do it a little earlier. Normally we do these the 3rd week of every month. I wanted to get to John just because the book is out and I think the timing is great, and also because he just joined. So that's pretty exciting. And then we have a YouTube channel. So this will be on the YouTube channel, but we have our own YouTube channel now. We are looking for more and more guests, and as part of we engage with the broader public and with game executives, we wanted to make sure we had a professional appearance. If you didn't know, the videos that we had for CAR-PGA were actually on my channel, my personal channel. So I really wanted to make sure that we got an opportunity to put them all in the right place there. So it is a channel. I can't say the name or the URL, because if I try to say the name or the URL, it won't make any sense. It's an alphabet soup of letters, but it is something we have. And I would encourage anyone who's hearing this to subscribe, because if you subscribe, we get enough subscribers, I think it's 50. We then get a shorter URL. And that doesn't mean a huge amount, other than we could sort of maybe get CAR-PGA as a URL. I think we're probably competing with a golf organization, but that aside, we can get something along those lines. And we have, in the terms of the CAR-PGA, we have already incorporated into our website. So it's already on there. If you look under our social channels, it's part of that. So I've announced it sort of electronically, but I wanted to let everybody know that we have our own YouTube channel, which is a big deal because it makes us easy. Yes, thank you, David. It makes it easier to find, but it also means that in terms of future guests and ensuring we have all access here, we can easily catalog them in the future. They're by month, going back. I guess it feels like we've been doing this for like 3 years, but it's only going back to the beginning of this year. So we have all those, and we'll add to them as we go through. So I don't know if we're going to get our guests today. I was hoping, but I did confirm it, but there may have been a technical issue. So I think we're probably going to we'll actually have the discussion, and if Steve joins, because we have plenty of material to work with, we'll happy to have him join in when he can. So today's discussion is about Steve Jackson Games. Steve Jackson Games probably doesn't need an introduction, but for those folks who aren't familiar, Steve Jackson Games encompasses quite a few different products. They've expanded to playing games, which is my introduction. Steve Jackson Games produces everything from Car Wars to Ogre, Fantasy Trip, GURPS, Melee to Munchkin. I know it through GURPS, actually, and Car Wars. Those are probably my introductions. So we've had a really exciting sort of look at the way Steve Jackson Games operates. One of the things that's interesting about Steve Jackson Games is they actually produce an annual report. They're very open with the state of affairs. So we brought up the state of affairs in 2020, Steve Jackson Games in 2020, and I think I can share that here. Let's see if I can get a separate screen here, just to show sort of the state of affairs as I talk through it. And I think that will work. So you can see here in the state of affairs sort of an overview of Steve Jackson Games. They do an executive summary, and they are unsparing in how 2020 went, but they are also very clear on how 2021, what the challenges are. So if you look at 2020, it's pretty clear, you know, some of the high points there. Let me see if I can zoom this in so we can read it a little easier. There we go. Evergreen is a big deal. So we talked about this before about how products within 2020 certainly have been challenged. And one of those challenges is global shipping. So anything that is easy to find, easy to sell, easy to produce because it's local or because it's something that everybody is familiar with is going to have an advantage. And certainly Evergreens were for the win there. Munchkin's a very powerful brand for Steve Jackson Games. I think probably, frankly, it's associated with it more than in some of the other products. Maybe for me, it's always been Car Wars and GURPS, but certainly a bunch of other products are now, and Munchkin being one of the newer ones comparatively compared to the other ones. So Munchkin's doing well. And then Car Wars, you know, Car Wars was crowdfunded, which we'll talk about. And it's really sort of a massive, massive opportunity. It generated over $1 million in support between BackerKit and Kickstarter. So Kickstarter is not the whole story, which is massive. And you know, there's a good reason for that. First of all, Car Wars brand name has been around, but the product was astounding, right, in terms of what they produced as well. So the Car Wars crowdfunding went well. I'm glad that it's performing, and I'm glad that they were able to get that. And you can see here, you know, that leads to the #1 theme, I think, which is crowdfunding is sort of how Steve Jackson Games is going to work. And I don't think they're alone. I write for N-World. EN Publishing is launching its own Level Up product, which is a sort of 5th edition variant. And it's on its path to hit $1 million as well. So crowdfunding is something that I would say most major publishers, except maybe some of the top ones like Wizards of the Coast, now regularly engage in as a business model. So really exciting to see. The most recent is Girl Genius. So Girl Genius is doing quite well for, let's see if I can bring that over here. What happens when I do that? Nothing happens. Okay. Girl Genius is, there we go, is currently at over 500% with 17 days to go. And so that's the latest on Steve Jackson Games, and it's clear that they are knocking it out of the park, and they've been doing it for at least 40 projects. And certainly there's more as their state of the report indicates. So lots of really cool stuff from Ogre to a bunch of other products that have done really well. And you know, Car Wars is in here, a bunch of others are in here, just because they have a massive brand recognition. Even the Fantasy Trip going back quite a bit, has done quite well. So these are products that have all been funded through crowdsourcing, and it's clear it works for Steve Jackson Games. Sylvia and I were talking about Illuminati. So Illuminati 2020, and this was a pet project of Steve's that he wanted to do, which was really to make sure they got that card game out. And they sort of did it locally and themselves. So there was a little bit of old school production, which is great. And they got it done. So I'm glad and very happy for them that they were able to sort of do a pet project, because as Steve writes, or actually Phil writes here, this is Phil Reed as CEO, you know, why have a game company if you can't do something like that when you want to now and then? So that was awesome. It's also really exciting is that the staff is okay. They even got bonuses, which is huge. So a lot of companies are not faring as well. And Steve Jackson Games, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, because they run a tight ship, did great and is still doing great. So I'm excited to see that they're operating well and doing okay. So glad that the staff is there. They mentioned a random fund generator, which is fun. And really just interesting games coming together with a bunch of different games, that 26 different games, which was a fun project. And again, a crowdfunded project. So more stuff. And ironically, Dice Bag. So this goes back to sort of, oldies but goodies. Everybody needs a dice bag. This is not a conversation where it's a situation where you need different products that are new. The staples matter in times like this. So that staple served them well. Then there's the stuff that wasn't as good as they'd hoped. We mentioned the Kickstarter, but of course the challenge is the pandemic. So the pandemic has certainly, caused challenges and delays, and Steve Jackson Games is not immune to that. So you can see that they are working on it. I think, frankly, the project's pretty ambitious, so that's a good reason too. But lots of opportunity there to hopefully get back on track. So they are not immune more than anybody else to get it done. And then new games. So you can see that a lot of the products, trying to get them out routinely, is obviously impacted by changes in the supply chain and disruptions. So that's a big challenge. You can see that why, right? That's under failures. The reality is that these kinds of situations where you have a disrupted supply chain, you have a pandemic just wreaking havoc on every aspect of production, right? And that's from wing to wing, as they say in business. So that's from the creation right through the transportation to bring it to your door or purchasing at your local game store. So pretty challenged for 2020. And understandably, this is something that everybody has. It's not just Steve Jackson Games. But if they felt it, you better believe all these smaller publishers are feeling it too. So they had to change release dates accordingly. And that is not a surprise. And I think that's just appropriate, but it is certainly something that it's just the reality of the new industry. Very sorry to hear that somebody had passed away on the team. It's clear that this is obviously people have worked at the company for years, and that's just heartbreaking. So sorry to hear that, but just a massive sort of outreach to them, because it's got to be a huge loss. Again, at a company, these aren't massive companies, even though they're big comparatively for role-playing games. Any loss of anybody is really just wrenching. So sorry to hear that. The state of the industry, I think, is an interesting insight into sort of where we're at here. See if I can just move this. So you can see, obviously, that convention shifted online. That's a big deal. I think that needed to happen. That was important and necessary. And a lot of people really moved to virtual gaming, which I think was important. So we're happy to see that folks have moved that. And obviously Gen Con has launched and sort of navigating back into Gen Con and other cons. You'll see more of that. Dungeons and Dragons is on an absolute massive upward spiral. Lots of factors contributing to that. Some of them being that D&D is eminently videoable or streamable, as we've discovered, and it lends itself to the kind of storytelling that is endemic to a lot of social media now. So if you can create stories, you've got an endless product, and D&D does that, as do all role-playing games. They are story generators. So the story generation aspect is a absolutely massive opportunity, and it lends itself to social, which I think is part of it. So the mystery of what gaming has been dispelled for sure. And as our video channel here is demonstrating, D&D is and streaming is all contributing in a virtuous cycle, with D&D over 33% increase in revenue. The latest numbers are coming out that Dungeons and Dragons is actually more profitable than the entire games division, if you can imagine that. So D&D is now starting, and I'm assuming D&D, Wizards of the Coast, in the context of Magic the Gathering also, so probably a few properties collectively is now outselling sort of the rest of the games within Hasbro. So that's just absolutely massive. and it makes the CAR-PGA's purpose more relevant than ever, but it also means there's lots of growing pains that we deal with all the time that we didn't deal with before, because the industry is way more popular than a niche group who happen to like to play games, at their house. I think survival is a really good point when you talk about state of the industry, which is most of the businesses are trying to make sure that they stay in business. This is definitely a survival scenario, and that's what they're looking to keep going is important. So you can see some of the shared goals here, and I think they're all pretty self-explanatory. But here's Steve Jackson priorities. And again, this is always a fascinating snapshot of how a business works. So not everybody is this transparent. Obviously, Car Wars being a priority, that's a big deal, and make sure the Kickstarter gets accomplished is huge. Munchkin, again, I'm saying Munchkin's new. It's almost 20 years old, but comparative to like Car Wars, I guess it's the newer. But Munchkin is a huge opportunity, and they keep licensing it out, which is just amazing. So Munchkin is a brand that sort of has multiple sub-brands in it that I think is doing well. And then Fantasy Trip. So Fantasy Trip, again, wanting to be the stalwarts of the early gaming fantasy games, coming right after D&D. So a huge opportunity there. And obviously the crowdfunding campaigns did well. So there's absolutely a need for that. So that was a 2020 report card. Not a surprise. Steve Jackson Games is still looking at survival as being a priority. We're not clear. Shipping is definitely a challenge. Evergreen titles sell well, so you stick with that. This is kind of a retrench where you stick with what you know. And obviously they're on the hook for the Car Wars, which did so well. We mentioned that $1 million campaign. So lots of work to do, but pretty excited about this. And I'm looking forward to when we get Phil's update for 2021. This is 2020. And I'm sure we'll have more to come from Steve Jackson Games. So let me check here to see if we've gotten anybody else joining. Don't think so. Okay. So I think one of the questions, Sylvia, you brought up, which was, did they actually raid? So this is this rumor, right? We've heard it before, which is what happened with, we heard something about like the FBI or something else where there was a raid on Steve Jackson Games. So here it is, just to give you this story. In 1990, Steve Jackson Games made national news when it filed suit after a destructive raid by the Secret Service. The Secret Service agents, in search of hackers, nearly forced the company out of business by seizing hardware and data files. With the help of the newly formed Electronic Frontier Foundation, Steve Jackson Games took the case to federal court, proved that the raid had been unjustified and improperly executed, and won more than $50,000 in damages. And the EFF remains active to prevent similar abuses. So, I don't know if we can see if this page loads. That story is sort of legendary. And yeah, here it is. So you can see it took a long time, 3 years later, to recover from the damages of that. But basically what happened was there was a raid. The home of Lloyd Blankenship, who was writing GURP Cyberpunk, so you can see where some of this confusion might have been happening, was also raided. A large amount of information was seized. It was 4 computers, 2 laser printers, some hard disks, and a great deal of assorted hardware. One of them was running the Illuminati BBS. And it wasn't just Cyberpunk files, but you can see they were looking for evidence. So they're, this is not a gentle operation, and include cutting off locks, forcing open foot lockers, and tearing up boxes, including bending letter openers. So Steve tried to get his stuff back, and he only got a few files. Unfortunately, some of them including the Illuminati BBS and GURP Cyberpunk. And they thought it was a handbook for computer crime without making distinction of, fake or real. And despite protests, you can see that it didn't get back right away. And that, of course, is damaging to any company. 4 months later, they get the hardware back, and they kept a lot of the stuff that had GURP Cyberpunk, unfortunately. So this was a pretty, you can imagine, we've already talked about challenges that any game company might have, right? we're talking about distribution challenges. We're talking about your product being up to date, your product going out of print. You're just getting, testing the winds to get your product produced correctly and at the right time. But in this case, you have the government rating your product, which is massively disruptive and basically damaged the company. And you can see here, they had to close their doors. They ended up laying half their employees, and it was years before they recovered. In fact, it's amazing that they did recover, to be honest, because that was a pretty tremendous loss. And then even getting it back requires some tenacity to do that. And they didn't even know why they were rated, as you can see. And it was really guilt by remote association, because Lloyd, doing work for some of the stuff he was working on, obviously he was talking to lots of people, and that was enough to sort of connect him to the wrong people. And as you can see there, he was basically rated because of the very tenuous affiliation. And the cyberpunk book sort of got swept up in the middle of that, and sort of was claimed to be the target of the raid, which it wasn't necessarily that in the first place. But the Electronic Frontier Foundation actually got involved, and it's thanks to them that they were able to help. And you can see some of this stuff came out in the press, and really basically brought it into the spotlight, which I think was one of the pieces that potentially helped, so that they eventually did win and got money and damages, covering their attorney fees, and getting their information back. So you can see here all this content, all this opportunity here to read. There's quite a few. It's well documented, but it is it's sort of a legendary situation that is forever associated with Steve Jackson Games, that I think is important and a critical part of history, unfortunately. So not something you want to be bragging about as part of your company history, but Steve Jackson Games came through it, which is fantastic. And I would say that lesser run companies probably wouldn't, and was able to survive. So I'm excited about that. And that's the story, Sylvia. So now you've got it in full detail, and you can get it's sjgames.com/ss if you want more details.
I just want to say that anybody who's played Illuminati should be able to tell that this was really the Bermuda Triangle controlling the Secret Service to try to control the secret masters of fandom. And anybody who hasn't played the Illuminati card game won't get what that means.
It's true. Truth is stranger than fiction. Probably not the first time, probably not the last time. Although I think maybe the current state of affairs are a little more tolerant, because there's just a lot more internet weirdness now, thanks to the internet. But back then, it was in the early 90s. Unfortunately, fact and fiction, if you didn't know one or the other, they looked awfully similar to the people who didn't know what they were looking at.
Well, another interesting thing too is it mentions that the count that they lost on, which was interception, meaning that right now in the Fifth Circuit, it's not interception of your email messages when law enforcement officials walk out the door with a computer holding them. And the fact is now all your emails are pretty much on the cloud. So it really isn't interception anymore, because that computer isn't the only one holding it.
Oh, you make a really good point. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's what people are always like. I don't know if you've ever seen that meme, but it's like, I'm not a serial killer. I'm just an author. I'm not, I'm not a terrorist. I'm just an author. I wrote a supplement for a spy game, and it was really based off of sort of like all these different action scenarios, but a lot of the details you wouldn't get from whatever scenarios you were thinking. So you had to look up the stuff, and I did some shady searches. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
So, no, I'm an author.
Business are in trouble if that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, like I want a little pin. Trust me, I'm an author. But it is one of the challenges of working with, as we were saying to Sylvia, the imagination. Sylvia, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yes, there is not only the fads on the scene. In Brazil, we had, as here, I suppose too, we had the religious, the fundamentalists against there is the Rio, more or less Rio de Janeiro. It's a bay. They have a great bay, and on the other side there is another city. It's Niterói, and you make the way from one to another into a large boat, where everybody gets into the boat to go and come from Rio. And then there was this guys playing AD&D in the boat. It was fantastic. They are playing, and then it comes a woman, took the book and throw in the ocean. This is a demon saying. She took the book and threw in the ocean.
She was saving their souls from Satan. We had a satanic panic in the 80s, and that was pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, that's actually in the Game Wizards. Although not interestingly, only from the media perspective, you see sort of how this spiraled, and it happened in America too, for sure. We could do a whole sort of panel just on that, but the short of it is that misperceptions of sort of gaming and imagination were something that I think nowadays, modern part of the streaming, frankly, movement and modern gaming has introduced a lot of the concepts that probably are not as unfamiliar as they used to be. But back then, the idea that imagination was one step away from religion, and therefore they could be very easily conflated, and therefore one was a threat to the other, depending on your perspective, was a very real concern for a lot of people. I have had personal experiences with stuff that I think now as a parent, and I'm like, if I was a parent and somebody pulled these things with the teachers that talked to me that way as a kid, if they had done that when I was a kid, if I was my parents, I can't even imagine. But it is definitely, it's a sign of the times, right? It was a different time where people didn't understand, and like you said, they would throw stuff in the ocean. Sylvia.
Yeah.
When I first got into college, there were these guys in our dorm we brought in to start introduce them to role playing. And we were playing Champions. And when they told their mom, she got really nervous because she had just seen this movie on TV called Mazes and Monsters, starring Tom Hanks. It was all about, playing in the sewers and going crazy, thinking you're your character. And we had to explain it to her that no, none of that stuff really happens.
I actually wrote a short story rebutting that in fiction that got published in my high school sort of magazine. It's so funny, I should drag it up just to embarrass myself, but I wrote it and it was this idea of basically saying, it was basically retelling that story and then going, well, that guy's just got a problem. That's not, it's not an evil game at the end of it. I don't think I convinced anybody. But I did have a high school teacher, an art teacher, who would spend entire classes berating me. And as a punk, myself being me, I found it very entertaining to debate with an adult. I thought that was great. But first of all, he wasn't doing his job. Like no one else is being taught anything. Second, the stuff he showed me was so spurious and it was all over the place. Like it would blame art stuff from Arduin Grimoire. Which was obviously sort of a campaign setting offshoot of D&D that's not mainstream D&D. It would come up with random things that were inaccurate, and he would just browbeat me for like an hour, and we would use the entire class arguing back and forth. It's just amazing. And again, like you can't imagine a teacher pulling this off today. You just can't imagine it. But back then, that's what happened. So.
Sounds like conversations about politics and religion now.
Oh, sorry, John, what was that?
Sounds like your typical internet conversation about religion and or politics now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I don't know that it's gotten better. It's just probably the conversations moved to different things. For a little while, Harry Potter was the threat. People forgot about D&D. Harry Potter sort of became the new D&D sort of esque, fantasy kind of. It's got witches and it's scary kind of thing. And
he took the bullet for us for a while.
Yeah, for a while. I mean, at this point, I think people are like, what do you, that thing on TV? Like, I think that the blessing and the curse of mainstream is some of that falls away and you get different problems. So obviously the CAR-PGA was partially founded because of response to this kind of ongoing, just criticism that was coming from all angles at all times. And there were people who were profiting from it, obviously, who, they weren't really interested, in my opinion, about whether it was right or wrong. They were just interested in the controversy, which, again, to your point, John, is not unlike some of the things we see today. So it's sort of an ongoing part of the human condition, I'm afraid. But yeah, Sylvia, it is definitely it's interesting to hear that I've talked to colleagues in the UK, and they've said that it wasn't the same. They had heard some things, so it's interesting to hear where you are, that there was a challenge there too.
Yes, it is.
But not anymore.
Now it's worse, because we have a far-right government.
Yeah.
And so we have a human rights ministry.
Mm-hmm.
She's a woman that she's, among other things, she says that she was healed because when she was 10, she saw Jesus
mm-hmm.
in a guava tree.
Okay.
Yeah, this is, yes.
Yeah.
And these people are completely the same thing as the one who threw the book in the ocean.
Yeah.
It's incredible. They are chasing culture, all kinds of culture and education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing in the Steve Jackson case, sorry.
Go ahead, Bill.
We went back to the Middle Age.
Mm.
In the Steve Jackson case, they weren't actually cracking down on role playing. They had just completely misunderstood what research for a role playing game was all about and thought it was involved in hacking and stuff.
Right.
Versus the Satanic Panic, which was definitely a fear of what are those strange kids doing over there in the basement and stuff.
Right. And there's a couple of those where you cross for law enforcement just because of what you're doing looks a little weird to the outsiders, right? The probably the more recent example after that was vampire. So a lot of vampire LARPs essentially meant kids dressed up in dark clothes at night, hanging out. And if you don't know what's going on, people call the police on you. Sometimes they played games in places that weren't limited. So that meant their game spilled over into the public. There was a game called Killer, and there was a game called what was the other one?
Killer was Steve Jackson Games.
Right, with Steve Jackson Games as well, right? Where you're sort of
play that in college and get
running around pretending to try and kill people. It doesn't go over well. Depending if you don't know what that's about, you may not be okay with it. So definitely, there's to people who don't know, it's understandable. It doesn't mean they should prosecute you or take your stuff, which is a bigger problem. But I get it's just you like them to ask versus raid your building, for example.
I'm surprised that whoever made How to Host a Murder party games didn't get raided.
I think that's because it was in private homes versus like Killer, which was across a college campus or someplace.
Right.
People were jumping out of bushes, shooting people with water guns and stuff, and surprising the heck out of everybody. Whereas I think How to Host a Murder was carefully designed to be in private spaces, so you weren't drawing as much attention.
Totally. And that's the escape rooms are sort of in that same kind of hybrid space where it's contained. But there was some raids in Poland around this stuff, and partially because escape rooms are very easy to run, but you're basically holding someone against their will. And they're willingly doing it theoretically, but it's a fine line between you lock somebody in a room and it's a game and they have to get out. And people died because of fires and stuff. So then you had a fire code concern. So again, some of this is for your own good. Some of it's because kids are kids and they do what they want to do, and they're going to try and push boundaries. And some of it is that the nature of gaming is boundary blurring. That's role playing is not. It's not clearly it's blurring the boundaries.
Yes, that's why we have to. Well, at least at my point of view, we have to establish some boundaries. For instance, the table is a boundary. When you are playing not a live action, for instance, but even a live action, you must be in a closed place.
Right. Or should be, yeah.
Yes, because these boundaries are important for the passage from reality to fantasy. We always we can the table, the paper, the pen that I saw a lot of people drawing during the game in the back of the character sheet. They drawing. These things are boundaries, and I think it's very important. Otherwise, it's a kind of fantasy delusion.
Well, and you bring up a good point
that we turn to be a fantasy delusion.
Right. Well, and this is and so, you know, the pendulum swings back and forth on this, right? So on the one hand, you want clear boundaries so you know when the game ends and begins. On the other hand, as role playing has become more popular, there are people who have real trauma coming into the game, and they need very clear boundaries so that they can step away from the game. You know, so what sounds like fun, we just published an article on N-World about horror and safety tools. So what sounds like fun to me, because I haven't had particularly bad trauma, when I do a scary Halloween game, may not be okay for everybody, especially if I'm playing over the internet, where there's not a table, to your point, Sylvia, or I'm playing with people I don't know, which is its own boundary. Knowing who you play with, many people are used to playing with their friends or colleagues. That creates boundaries. If you are playing with people, and this is what's happening, right? We have this now massive internet experiment with gaming where people are playing more than ever with people they don't know. Where the boundaries begin and end is fungible. It's not at the table. You can't just get up from the table. You're on a video channel like ourselves. So the boundary becomes a little bit ill-defined, and people are trying to claw that back with tools and whatever makes sense for them.
Research, we teach classes on safety tools, boundaries, both for LARP and tabletop role-playing games. The magic circle or the alibi, that, you know, distinguishing the difference between yourself and your character or your ego, and your alibi that you have between that. This is what my character's doing. I have nothing to do with it. You know, it's not my fault.
Right. And
to distinguish the difference between a real life trauma and somebody acting.
Right. Yep. And it's interesting too, because the people who deal with this a lot are improv actors. I did an article about that recently, and they talked about how draining doing improv is, because you're mentally sort of switching, and then then you're like, I shouldn't feel this way. Well, okay, but you were acting a thing, and then you start feeling it later. So these are people who are trying to do it more frequently. Gaming isn't always that way, right? So some tabletop gaming may not have that at all, and some gaming may have it in bursts where you are actually inhabiting a role. But it is something different for different people. And I think one of the things that we've certainly started to come to see as gaming has become this global phenomenon is that not everybody comes at it the same way. So those tools and where the magic circle is and all that is different for everybody. So it's not a one size fits all approach. And I think it's a good dialogue that we're having. However, I do think folks from the 80s, like myself, who have had to fight so hard to say, I'm not getting lost in the fantasy. I'm not, to your point, Bill, going to get lost in a maze because mazes and monsters like Tom Hanks. Now we're flipping the script and going, well, you might get, I'm not saying you're going to lose yourself in a fantasy, but you are going to, we're now saying there's tools to prevent that from being traumatic. And it's very hard to flip that script, I think, for some folks who for so long were trying to argue, I'm okay, it's separate. It's fantasy, don't worry about it. And now you're like, well, wait a minute. It is fantasy, but it could be harmful to people who aren't ready, because of whatever, again, take your pick of how it affects them. So it's funny because times have changed, for sure.
That's what we call bleed.
Right, bleed.
The game, what's happening in the game affects you in real life. What you came in from real life affecting what's happening in the game. And managing that is a great. So we still want to hit flow state where we have the ultimate level of emotion, but we want people not to hit flow state where they forget that this isn't real and Jimmy didn't really die.
Right. Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of those things that I think there's not a, you know, it's not a clear chart where it's good for you. The individuals have to figure that out. And it also changes based on their circumstances, their time, what's going on in their lives, you know, even the physical environment, to your point, Sylvia. So like, I found it very disruptive. We had a guy, I never forget it. We went to play and I was playing a sort of a, you know, X-Files horror game. So there was horror, but you know, my group was never going to go 100% horror. So it was like horror, but you can shoot the horror, right? So the aliens, but you can shoot them. And there was a guy who was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna watch. I'm not gonna play. I'm just gonna hang out." And he like played a video game and like listened in. Now I don't mind people observing, but like a person who sort of like was kind of there, like we didn't know why he was there. I think he didn't know we were gonna come over. It was just super awkward, and it really was hard for me to get into the game, right? Because you just were a little like, you constantly knew there was somebody sort of over your shoulder, I don't know, judging you. I don't know what I felt, but it was one of those things that just the physical environment of not having it defined and having somebody be like, oh, really, you know, was tough. So, you know, all those things, and to your point, John, when you get it right, it's magic. But getting it right is a formula you tweak every time. And it's the players. You know, one of the things that I've learned, I stopped doing it. I used to go to Gen Con by myself, and I would play in con games. And how those con games would go was almost entirely determined by my co-players and the DM. It was not like the scenario was well written, which was fine, but it was never like, oh, it's a good game of D&D, so everything will be perfect. It was how, of those 4 to 5 other people, what were they like? Most of the times it wasn't great because you're rolling the dice, right? So you got people who were sort of not into D&D, didn't want to be there, had different priorities. But when you got the right group, it was magical. And of course, a group of friends is easier to get there because you hopefully play more frequently, and you have you figure out what works and what doesn't, either through your friendship or through gaming frequently. You learn what works and what doesn't. But it is an art. More than a science.
Is it
Definitely an art form.
consent
Sorry.
form? Sorry, Bill. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was asking, did anybody ever use a consent form in their games?
People do that now, actually. I forget what they're calling it. It's not so much a consent form as, what's the term for it these days? I can't remember, but it's becoming
Something in lines, right?
I don't
Veils and lines. I think I'm not saying
Lines
right.
and veils.
Lines and veils. Thank you, Dave.
But people do
Games.
free consent forms for online games, and others now. Some do, especially professionals. You know, people running games for pay.
Yeah, you're getting in a tricky area then of people being able to think they can sue you if they've been traumatized or something. So yeah,
We
evolution.
From Good Games, and we do put out content warnings for games that we're running in public. Warning: we are going to kill and eat children, or whatever happens to be there. It is, and we record most of our games just for those same safety things to protect us from somebody going, you did this horrible thing to us, and this is not what we agreed to.
Right. Right. Now, here's the question. Is there ever anybody who goes, nope, I'm out? Or does that filter them before they get there?
The content warnings occasionally will filter out a person, but as far as somebody who got back past the part where they've done a consent form,
right?
They're sitting there specifically saying, you know, we have green, yellow, red for each category, and if anybody, just one person, including the game master, indicates a red on a topic, that topic is avoided. Yellow ones, we're going to be more cautious about it. Green, we're just, if it's part of the story, it's going to be part of the story. So we try to work around the concerns towards the most restricted player.
Right.
But hopefully nobody comes into the terror of the circus, of the nightmare circus, and has a fear of clowns.
Right.
You know, that should be self-censorship. I'm not going to put myself into that scenario to begin with.
Yeah, and these
But
tools don't absolve people from, like as people have said, there's got to be a little give and take, right? So if we give you the tool, you got to speak. If we give you the tool and you don't say anything, there's only so much you can do. And to your point, like maybe don't go to the scenario that's about evil circus if you sort of know, you don't like clowns. But hopefully that give and take is easier to have as a dialogue by going halfway and saying, here's at least the tools and the opportunity to say something versus sort of saying, oh, I didn't know you didn't like that, right?
Our biggest issue is right now with public games, or like pug games. Where basically the only thing I have time for is to advertise ahead of time that here's the triggers. We will be using safety tools, X-Card or the Flower, or we announce what safety tools we're using. And then hopefully the people will come in, because we don't have the time to do a 15-minute class on safety tools.
Right.
Or to have them all fill out the consent form for a one-shot game.
Right. And how often are the X cards used? Has it happened? How often have X cards been used? Have you seen them used?
Once. Most people are glad to have it available at the table. They don't usually end up having to tap it. I did have somebody who was playing Ravenloft, and their character was possessed. And they did not realize until that happened that this was a trigger. And he was getting more and more upset. The game master thought it was acting.
Right.
And he finally stated, X-Card, I'm not having fun anymore. We need to fix this. He should have said something a lot sooner. But other than that, I haven't had a lot of use of X cards. I've had a couple occasional cautions. People saying it's getting a little thing, or can I talk to you a moment? But as far as having to say, no, I've hit my red line, very rarely, because we tell them ahead of time what to expect.
Excellent. And John, I don't have to tell you this, but when a lot of times these internet dialogues in this devolve into, oh God, everybody's going to abuse the X card. They'll be hitting the red constantly and like no one can get anything done. So it's great to hear actual real life experience with how it operates, which is, to your point, that's not going to be fun anyway for that person. So it's great to have them have the tool to opt out if they need to.
And in the scenario that happened with the person who finally had to hit the X card, was we took a break. I talked to the other players that were present at the table while the GM went and talked to the player, find out where the actual issue was and things like that. We came back to the table and the possession was ended. But it could have been handled better just by the player advocating sooner.
Right.
And by the GM explaining the actual parameters of the scenario better, because this was a possession, but it wasn't a possession with control.
Right.
It's just doing a ride on.
Yeah.
Right along.
Right. And look, the problem with trauma is trauma doesn't play rules and it's not logical, right? So,
they don't call it a phobia because it's logical.
Right. So, even people who know sort of what they're grappling with doesn't mean that they can engage with it in a way that, is as clean and easy as we'd like it sometimes. But I appreciate you sharing that story. That's really, again, this is reality. This is what it, and of course you're dealing with the public, which means it's a wide variety of experiences and a wide variety of play topics too, right? So this helps everybody navigate quickly because that's part of it. I think, you know, for folks like myself who are used to gaming with your friends for decades in some cases, we all sort of know each other pretty well intuitively, and sometimes we don't even know each other as well as we think, by the way. But it may seem like you don't need these tools. And the reality, of course, is there, as we talk about this global phenomenon of people coming together in the hobby that we love, it's really important to have some means of sort of safely entering and leaving a game. So I think it's great to see it in action.
Have you heard of Zombie Orpheus? Or I always say it wrong. Orpheus?
Orpheus, yep.
They make movies and television shows like things like that. They went to Mongolia. This is just an example of people's backgrounds impacting how they do. They went to Mongolia to do a television episode, and they explained to them, yeah, this is a fiction fantasy story where the government is controlling magic. If you're able to, or if you practice magic, you'll be rounded up and put into camps and things like that. And then the Mongolians were like, okay, but where's the fiction? Because they actually went through that with the communists taking shamans, locking them up, denying that you can do the religious practices and things like that. So when they were presented the story, it was like, yeah, that happened. We've been there.
Yeah. One of the things that was posted recently, which is sort of a fascinating discussion of, and I'm going to bring this back around to Halloween as we wrap up here. We're just about at time. Is that there are people, the actors in haunted houses get beat up. They get bruises, they get slammed, they get punched. And the bottom line is, it is no different in a lot of ways of the LARPing and the role playing we're talking about. The problem is you have strangers joining who aren't respecting the rules, and they do it for all kinds of reasons. They do it because it's funny. They do it because they don't see the actors as people. They do it because they want to seem tough because they're in a scary environment and they're sort of trying to react. And some people are doing it probably because they have trauma. But there was one actor, you know, and these guys are they're doing it part-time, who had bruises all along his arm and his back because he got attacked doing his job. And all he was doing was trying to scare people in a haunted house, and they jump out. They're not supposed to touch you, or you sign something where they can, kind of, threaten you, but that's it. And people were attacking him. And it's so, it's an extreme example, but it is very much, to your point, Sylvia, this idea of what's the boundaries, right? So, did you buy into the fact you went to a haunted house? Okay. Do you understand there are actors, they're human beings, they're not robots that are going to pretend to attack you? That's part of the horror. It's part of the jump scare. It's part of the setting. But it is one of those things that, some people go in there on a dare. They go in, they shouldn't go in. Maybe it triggers a phobia. We don't know. But you've got a large mass of humanity encountering a fantasy and not always reacting well to it. And, part of a hobby, if you do it all the time, is to have the rules and hopefully help better define those boundaries, even when they're, in our case, they're virtual in some cases. But here's a physical example where, a haunted house is role play. You go in, you're going to pretend to be a victim. They're going to pretend to be some kind of horrible thing. And you're going to come out and hopefully we're going to all feel good about it and laugh about it afterwards. But that's not everybody, unfortunately. And, Halloween is such a sort of a fun, to me, demonstration of what we see as role playing is dress up. Now you're allowed to dress up. Yeah. Oh, it's Halloween, so now we're allowed to dress up. Not like when you play LARPs. That's different. So sort of Halloween has become a cultural norm of a lot of what I consider to be role playing elements condensed into one night. And it has the same challenges that we have in role playing, including respecting boundaries.
Mm-hmm. That's the case with the live action.
Right.
You
totally.
At least those that I took part in, there was some rules. You have previews. Every player receives the rules.
And Sylvia, I guarantee you there's probably better rules for LARPing than there probably is for some of these haunted houses, unfortunately. Because of course, as a hobby, and if you do it frequently, you know, we know what the boundaries are. We've learned them the hard way. But I don't know if these, you know, some of these haunted houses may pop up for like a month and they're gone, right? So who knows how they're operated. But and just because you do that doesn't mean everybody, you know, LARPers who regularly play together probably get it. They understand the rules versus someone who just is a visitor to a haunted house that doesn't know anything about that. You know, final example real quick. So I don't know if I mentioned this, David, last time, but Star Wars in Disney is a very immersive experience. Disney made a real choice to make the Star Wars area, the galactic outpost.
Galaxy's Edge.
Thank you. Galaxy's Edge, which is Black Spire Outpost, I think. A role-playing experience. So that means everything in the place is in theme. The credit card tool uses credits. All the staff speak using, they say good sons or something along those lines. And basically you can encounter role playing anywhere you walk. And of course, for my family, we just love it. We were tickled pink, loved the whole thing. But there are a lot of people who are very confused when they ask for where the bathroom was, and somebody says the refresher is over here, or they talk about credits, or they basically stayed in character. So Disney actually had to pull it back. They had to change it. Now, the other thing, by the way, is that not everybody was fully fluent in English. So that's problematic too. You have people visiting who go, what are you talking? What do you mean refresher? That's like a different phrase for toilet in Star Wars. So Disney had to actually ratchet back the role play because of the broad population they were working with. And it was just sort of an interesting top. Now, I have no idea how the hotel is going. If you heard, the hotel is a fully immersive. I may try and do it next year. We'll see if we can get the funds together and, you know, COVID. But would love to sort of report out on how that goes, because that's supposed to be a fully immersive experience and really an interesting thing. And I've seen people say, no, thank you. Like, that's too much for me. I don't want to be role playing at a hotel. But it sounds an awful lot like a LARP to me. So I'm sold.
Yeah.
Well, and that's so. I thank you so much. You've all been such good sports. I'm sorry we weren't able to get our guest. Hopefully, we can reschedule. I think this is I really appreciate John and Bill and David and Sylvia your conversation. I think it was really good. Even if we didn't get to talk to Steve Jackson, we at least got to see sort of the background on Steve Jackson games and discuss some really relevant and interesting points. So happy Halloween if you celebrate Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween.
We're going to meet again on November 4th. Again, the Game Wizards book, if you haven't, I think it's out electronically as well. Definitely recommend to read. This is funny when I flop this around. Okay, like this. And I'll definitely have my report ready, and I'm hoping to have a review out before then. So David, I'll make sure I point that out as well.
Okay, you are going to write to write down the name of this book.
Yes, it's called The Game Wizards, but I will send a note out after for sure.
Okay.
And John is going to be joining us.
It was nice seeing John's cat, because
I love your
cats,
cats, John.
and conditions of Zoom demand that a cat appear at least once during every Zoom call.
I like that there was a black one and there was one up top there who sort of was looking down. I love that. That was fun. Yes.
And Bree is the black one.
Love it. Yeah, I have Loki and Freya, and usually one of them disrupts something. That's just a requirement. So they decided to stay away today, but maybe next time. All right. Thank you so much, all. I'll put the video up. So this will be up so we can, anyone who missed it. And to your point, Sylvia, I'll make sure I cover all the links as well.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.